Once you've built up an army, the next step is to actually use it. A lot of the time, you're better off just grouping your entire army together and attacking the front of your opponent's base. Sometimes you have to get a bit more sophisticated though. You might need to micro your units a bit so they don't just run into the meat grinder. Keeping melee units from running forward when you don't want them to is a very important part of controlling your units. Micro, aka actively controlling your units, is just one way you can use your units to try and gain an advantage. Another way is to employ tactics. With good tactics, you can make the most out of small numbers of units, or do significantly more damage to your opponent compared to just patrolling your units forward. Our first tactic is exploiting when a resource overchops to get past walls without actually taking them down. Once a resource node is completely depleted, it disappears, making the tile that it was on walkable. This can lead to holes in your wall naturally over time if you're not careful. It's called overchop because it most frequently happens at wood lines. We still use this term when berries, gold, or stone finishes as well though. One of the best ways to exploit overchop is when you're going men-at-arms. The plan is to scout ahead with your scout cavalry and see if a tree or berry bush is running low. In the exact time that the resource runs out, you can block that tile from being built on with your scout, and then run your men-at-arms in to attack the villagers. Keeping your scout on stand ground will prevent it from moving out of position while your men-at-arms are on the way. You have to be careful about being too overeager and attacking villagers with your scout before your men-at-arms arrive though, otherwise you'll alert your enemy early, giving them more time to react. This tactic relies on the element of surprise, so try to be sneaky until all of your units are in place. Another common time you can be checking for overchop is when you have scouts running around your enemy's base. If all of their resources are walled, then you can try to time your scouts running past a certain area just as a tree or berry bush overchops. This tactic can kill multiple villagers, which actually can be enough to win games sometimes. There's a related tactic that requires a little bit more investment from you, but can still be completely worth the cost. If you see that your opponent has a straggler tree as part of their walls, you can bring a villager to chop it and then delete the tree by placing a building on top of it. This can really throw your opponent off guard because he won't get an attack notification as you never attacked one of his buildings to get in. Also, the fact that he thought he was full walled means that his army might be really out of position to defend. Keep in mind that this tactic costs you quite a few resources as you need to bring a villager forward. You're also risking losing the villager too, so it's sort of a medium risk, high reward play. These are the kinds of plays that you have to make if you get behind though. This next tactic is a pretty simple one that you should be thinking about almost every game, especially in Feudal Age. Try to think of where in your base you're vulnerable to enemy attacks and position your units there. This can mean defending an exposed woodline or berries with a spearman, or maybe keeping ranged units on a hill near the front of your base so your opponent doesn't take that hill. If your opponent opens scouts and you don't know where they are, keeping a spearman or two near your walling villagers can also be important. Against ranged units, controlling hills is especially important since the hill bonus is massive in this game. Not only do units deal 25% more damage to targets on the low ground, they also take 25% less damage from those same low ground units. This means that an archer will do 6.25 damage from the high ground and take only 3.75 damage from an archer on the low ground. The low ground archer goes down in 5 hits, and the high ground archer goes down in 8 hits. The key here is to position your units in places that actually need defending, so don't put your units near your town center and don't put your spearmen near a woodline that you've already walled. This all just means that you should position your units in a way that your opponent can't easily damage you. Thinking about your base layout more can help you later when you want to place town centers and castles as well. Next up is another big one. Since this is a real-time game, the most important resource is not food or gold, it's your attention. Forcing your opponent to multitask is the best way to make them make a mistake. You can only look in one place at a time, so if you attack your opponent in 2 places at the same time, there's a good chance they'll react poorly in at least one of those places. Even just tapping your opponent's walls with your scout while you position your archers behind a woodline can be enough to distract your opponent so they take more damage from the archers. You just have to make sure to attack with the scouts slightly earlier than the archers so that while your opponent goes and checks what's attacking his walls, he misses the archers coming into view. An even more common example would be to split up your archers and hit 2 woodlines at once. Synchronizing your attacks is again very important. Sometimes you have to wait on one side while your other army gets into position. Once your units are in position, strike simultaneously. You don't just have to use ranged units for this as well. Attacking multiple parts of your opponent's walls with knights will force more villagers to wall behind and increase the chances of your opponent letting your knights in. Even one knight that gets in can clear out an entire woodline on its own, so if your plan is to raid, then you don't need to keep all of your knights together. Of course, if you run into your opponent's main army, then you should retreat if you don't have enough knights to win against it. On the topic of doing lots of damage with little army, feigning aggression versus the opponent's main army while you raid can be huge. A lot of the time, you'll want to be watching the first big fight of early Imperial Age, so if you fake that you're committing to a big push up a hill while you send units to raid, you can really catch your opponent off guard. Basically, what happens is that neither player wants to attack into the other because both players control a hill with a castle on it. If you send your units to attack up the hill and then immediately fall back, then your opponent has to pull back his units so they don't run forward under your castle. During this time, if you send in even a small raiding party, it can do massive damage since your opponent will likely be slow to react. One final use of this tactic that I'll mention here is when raiding, especially with Hussar in the late game. It's much easier to deal with 20 Hussar in one location compared to those same Hussar in 4 locations. Not only does it force more idle time as more villagers have to hide in buildings, it also forces your opponent to split his army more, which takes longer, and can also lead to the situation where he doesn't send enough army to a certain area, leading to the Hussars just killing the halves and continuing raiding. The more army your opponent has to send to deal with raids, the less he'll have on the front, so during a raid, it can be the perfect time to siege the front. Speaking of sieging, when this is your strategy in Castle Age, protecting your siege is of utmost importance. Investing thousands of resources into siege to have it all die while you try to raid is a great way to throw the game. Siege units require protection a lot of the time, so keeping your main army near your siege units instead of raiding is often the best call. If you go in to raid, then you're giving your opponent a chance to shut down your push while your units are out of position. Splitting a small number of units is sometimes okay, especially after you have some monks out, but you have to be careful not to waste units, as when you're sieging in Castle Age, it means that you're investing less into your economy, which means that you have to do damage to your opponent, otherwise you'll be behind. Failed siege pushes have lost many people many games. You can apply this line of thinking in other ways too, not just Castle Age sieging. The tactics that you use should be relevant to the state of the game. Don't make risky plays if you're ahead and the Civ matchup later on is decent. Going for a forward castle while your army is doing something else will lose you games that you should have won. Splitting your army when you should just keep it together and attack the front can be bad as well. If you have 40 knights and your opponent has 35, if you split with 20, then of course you'll lose, but did you know that the remaining knights can clean up the other 20 that you didn't have in the fight as well? This splitting your army tactic is better when you're against slower units, you have defenses that you can fall back to, or you can still fight your enemy's army head on without those split off units. Understanding the state of the game can be tricky, but very important when you decide which tactics to use. The last tip I have for you today is one of my favorites. When up against crossbowmen or cavalry archers, and you want to counter them with elite skirmishers, you can often catch them out of position if they try to harass one of your back wood lines. Since elite skirmishers hard counter crossbowmen and cavalry archers, you can afford to split up your army in half and still win against them. This lets you push the enemy units away with half and flank with the other half. If you have ballistics, this can lead to a major victory, since if you kill a large portion of your opponent's army, that gives you the option to go more greedy with your boom, go forward with more aggression, or invest into a tech switch. You generally only have to do this flanking maneuver when your units are the same speed or slower than your opponents. With knights against crossbowmen, you can usually just send everything in from the front and get some of them to try a surround. Another use for this flanking trap is with mangonels versus crossbowmen. This one's a bit more risky as it relies on your opponent not watching his units. Players generally won't patrol their units near your base when sneaking around with crossbowmen because they don't want their units to accidentally alert you by attacking a building. This means that their crossbowmen will be moving with just a move command, likely in line formation, which makes them very susceptible to a sneak mangonel out of nowhere. Of course, if your opponent sees your mangonel, then they'll easily micro it down with their crossbowmen. This is a high risk, high reward play, which can be good if you're really far behind. And that's it for this one. There are many more tactics that can be used, so if you want another video like this one, leave a comment with a tactic that could be useful. I'll see you in the next one.